Hey guys, what's up? Welcome back here to today's edition of Intuitive Angling, and really appreciate you guys swinging by the channel to check today's episode out. And guys, we got a good video for y'all today. We're going to be talking about when and when not to use braided fishing line, because out of everybody I fish with, co-anglers, people I take on my on-the-water lessons, it seems like to me there is a biggest misconception about when and when not to use braided fishing line, in terms of you have a choice between mono, fluorocarbon, and braid. And I'm sort of going to go over what I have seen as far as mistakes people make when and when they don't fish braided line, and go over in this video the exact set of situations where you do want to use braided line and when you don't want to use it. I think it's definitely going to add up to a lot more fish for you guys once you start instituting some of these changes. Also, guys, a couple quick things here. If you guys are interested in supporting intuitive angling, just a couple things, a couple different ways you can do that. Subscribing to the channel, free and easy. That's a good way to do it. Also, if you're one of the viewers out there that have been using and bookmarking my tackle warehouse link that I put in every video description, you're doing a really big part to support the channel, along with using all those other links. So thank you very much for keeping intuitive angling on YouTube here. Really appreciate that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about braided fishing line, fluorocarbon, mono, when and when not to use all this stuff. First of all, one of the things I like to do in my videos, I like to give you guys a little bit of history in what we talk about. Now, the braided fishing lines have been around forever. They used to be called Dacron fishing lines, which was basically like a braid with no stretch. This has been around forever, since like the 1940s. But it wasn't until like the mid 1990s where they started developing some advanced technology in braided line, where they had some different color options. It was a little bit more fishable. The diameters were a little bit smaller. And then fast forward to like the past 10 years, there's been a tremendous amount of advancement in companies like Seaguar and other fishing line companies to develop very, very small diameter braided lines with different colors, more low visibility lines. But ultimately, the thing about braided line that separates it from any other fishing line is you don't have any stretch. You do have the other variables as far as colors and diameter, but when you're talking about instituting it as part of your fishing technique, that's the primary, metric to go by, is the fact that there's no stretch in that line. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about when and when you do not want to use braided fishing line, when to go with it. Now, from my perspective, from what I have seen in all my observations of people fishing and my own fishing, I believe that people use braided line too much overall. And I think the reason they do that is they watch people do it on TV. It's sort of the same thing with like the braid to fluorocarbon and, the gold braid and that type of stuff. A lot of people follow and copy other people when they see they do it. But one of the things about braided fishing line that I think people use it too much is they underestimate the properties of the higher visibility of braided line and the no stretch capabilities of it. Now, you have to know when and when not you need this type of property in a fishing line. So here is when you want to use braided line, and I'm going to talk about when you don't want to use it. Braided line, in my opinion, are situations where you are fishing either where the line doesn't matter as far as the terms of the visibility of it, or where you've got to have that extra power where there's no stretch. So let's talk a little bit about both of those. The times that you need extra power with no stretch are times like when you're fishing a frog over matted vegetation, or if you're flipping and pitching extremely heavy matted cover that's like very, very gnarly and hard to get the fish out of. So, for example, flipping and pitching like matted vegetation, matted hyacinths, maybe some flooded bushes that are like so thick and gnarly and difficult and deep that if you throw a fluorocarbon line, the stretch is going to make you lose the fish. Those are some of the situations where you definitely want to use it under those conditions, which are not a lot of conditions, because anymore it's like there's not really that many places that people fish like a frog. Unless you're fishing a body of water that has aquatic vegetation, that's a non-issue, and most lakes across the country do not have aquatic vegetation. And then the same with the flipping. The flipping is sort of relegated to that same type of scenario being the matted vegetation, hyacinths, lily pads, all that type of structure. So you're talking about braided line being more of a factor in the southern tier states where you do have that vegetation there. Now, some people will throw a braided fishing line on some top waters that they cast and reel across the surface that are not on matted vegetation. Like some people use braided line on a buzzbait, some people use braided line on a whopper plopper. I don't like either one of them. Personally, the only top waters that I fish a frog with fish a braided line with are a frog or like some type of a buzz toad, like a horny toad, something like that. When I'm fishing over some type of thick vegetation, that's about the only time that I'll use it. And the only time that I use it flipping are those situations that we talked about before. Super, super, super thick vegetation or thick cover. Let me give you a couple different times, a couple different scenarios where I use braided line for flipping. Anytime that I'm in Florida, if I'm flipping a big heavy weight, like a big 1 ounce or heavier weight, most of the time I'm going to use braided line, simply because when you're flipping and pitching that matted vegetation, it's super, super dark, and the water's usually shallow, and usually that heavy weight, when it drops down 2 or 3 feet, they hit it like almost immediately when it goes through there. So the fish don't really have time to get a visual on that line, and you need that extra power. The other times that I've used it, I'll give you an example. I was fishing a tournament at Sam Rayburn Lake about 7 or 8 years ago. The lake was about 10 foot high, and Sam Rayburn Lake, they've got these really thick, I guess I call them mesquite trees or something, but they're some of the tightest, small little bitty limbs on them, super, super thick. I'm talking super thick, and the water in these bushes were about 8 to 10 feet. They were in about 8 to 10 feet of water, and the fish were on the bottom in 8 to 10 feet of water. And it was so thick that I could not get these fish out with fluorocarbon line. I had to use braided line, even though I think it cut the number of strikes I was getting down. So that's a couple different scenarios with it. Okay, now more importantly, let's talk about when not to use braided line in your fishing. You never want to use braided line ever when you have a consideration or a factor of the visibility issue. So if braided line has no place in clear water whatsoever. So never use braided line in clear water situations, especially if you do not have thick cover. That's going to take away the number of strikes that you have tremendously. That's one of the reasons that I don't use braided fluorocarbon on a spinning outfit, because if you're fishing, say you're fishing a body of water that's like 7 or 8 foot clarity, a lot of guys use that yellow braided line now. Now, if you've got like a 10-foot leader on say you're fishing 25 or 30 foot of water, and you've got a 10-foot leader on a braided fluorocarbon, and you're using that yellow line, you can't tell me that a bass cannot look up there 10 feet higher and see that yellow line in that clear water. Now, whether or not that makes a difference to getting a bite, that's up for debate, but in my opinion it does, because bass are super aware. You can put a lifelike crawdad lure that looks exactly like a crawdad next to a real crawdad, and they'll never hit that artificial crawdad. They'll always hit the real one. So they're aware of the visual stuff like that. So it only makes sense that they may or may not, or possibly detect this long piece of yellow rope going into the water. That's one reason. Okay, the other reason with that is, aside from the clarity issue, is sometimes you want the stretch. The stretch of fluorocarbon or monofilament can help you out tremendously under certain situations. So let's say, for example, you're pitching and flipping dock pilings, or you're pitching and flipping around, maybe some stumps in the water, anything like that, where you're not actually in penetrating cover, you're just on the perimeter of that cover. In a situation like that, when you're pitching and flipping maybe from anywhere between 15 to 20 or 30 foot away from the boat, and you set the hook, you want that stretch that the fluorocarbon or monofilament provides, because what happens is when that bass bites your jig or bites your creature bait or bites your Texas rig worm, and you set the hook with braided line with no stretch, if you set that hook with any type of force whatsoever, and that bass happens to get hooked in the upper part of the mouth, like where the thin part is, like here on a fish, you're gonna rip a hole in that fish's mouth for sure. And a lot of times they'll come up and throw the bait. So if you have fluorocarbon or monofilament fishing and you set the hook, the stretch on that line will allow that impact when you set the hook to be more minimal, and you'll just punch a hole instead of ripping a hole in the fish's mouth. That's a big part of it. The next thing with it is when you're actually fighting a fish, again, you want the give and you want the stretch. So when you're fighting a fish with braided line, there's no stretch there. So the fish has a lot more leverage to throw the bait or pull off with braided line when they make a surge or a run. And if you're using fluorocarbon or monofilament, it's a lot more forgiving with that. So those are some of the key elements to remember as far as the choice with that. So in my opinion, let me give you guys my opinion on when and when not to use braided fishing line. Also, guys, I will put my Seaguar fishing line link in the description, guys. You guys know I've been using Seaguar forever. They make a unbelievable line of fluorocarbon and braided fishing line, so I'll put that in my Tackle Warehouse link in the description if you want to get some. But here's my advice. Go number one with like the gray. Seaguar makes a braided line called Smackdown, and they have a stealth gray, which is super invisible. If you're going to use braided line, use that low vis braid. But the only time that you really need to consider using braided fishing line, like I said, is for your frog fishing or your buzz toad fishing, number one, or if you're flipping and pitching that super thick gnarly stuff. If you're flipping and pitching like bushes, like flooded bushes, if you're flipping and pitching like lily pads or some type of grass that's not matted, always go to fluorocarbon. Because I tell you, let me give you guys one little scenario here. I know a lot of guys that live in Florida, and and these guys flip mats all the time. I've had a lot of people tell me that they will go to mono or fluorocarbon flipping thick mats, because when you flip in the thick mat with braided line and you're moving your bait like that, there's the sound that is created by that braided line over that vegetation that will sometimes spook the fish. And there's a lot of guys under tough fishing conditions, they will use 25 or 30 pound test braid or monofilament flipping that matted vegetation. You know, don't use braided line unless you absolutely need to. A lot of people also use braided line because it lasts longer. They put it on their spool and it just doesn't work. I had this one, let me tell you one scenario. I had this one on the water lesson a couple years ago, and we were in this particular deal. We were doing a couple different things. We were fishing shaky heads, like on points. Water was pretty clear down at Table Rock Lake. And then we were flipping bushes in clear water. And the angler that I had that day, every rod he had braided line on it. And I said, dude, you're not gonna catch anything on that braided line. I said, we're fishing. He had like 20 pound test straight braid on a shaky head. And then he had like his creature baits, he had them like on 65 pound braid. And I go, you're not gonna catch anything on that. And he goes, well, I really like braided line. And he started fishing, and after I'd caught about 15 fish with fluorocarbon and he hadn't had a bite, he understood it. So we went down and we re-spooled all of his stuff. I had line in the boat with me, fluorocarbon, that Seaguar and VisX, and he put it on and started catching fish. So main thing, guys, if I could give you one piece of advice, use fluorocarbon as your primary line. It's clear, it's low stretch, but it does have some stretch. You're going to get more bites with it. You're going to land more fish with it. It's just a better tool for bass fishing. Do not overly rely on braided line as the point of this video is what I want to make here. So anyway, I hope it helps out, guys. We'll talk later.